in the context of Azure Sentinel. So please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Maarten Goet, a Microsoft MVP from the Netherlands. I've been an MVP since 2007 and a regional director since 2015. I'm also a pilot, so I joke around that I navigate the real clouds, having my private pilot's license, and I'm the founder of Experts Live, among other things. So welcome to the session. So today, talking about adversary emulation with Azure Sentinel, we'll also briefly touch on Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Microsoft 365 Defender. We'll actually feature the new unified portal, and we'll do this all in the context of Monkey Island, a favorite game of mine from the 80s and I guess 90s. So what I'm assuming in this session is that you already know the basics of Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel being Microsoft's cloud-native SIEM that lives in Microsoft Azure, but certainly works with other clouds like AWS or on-prem technologies. Because it lives in the cloud, you get limitless cloud speed and scale. And the scale makes sense because of the storage you might need, but also speed is there for machine learning models and other future compute needs. And machine learning is built in with easy integration for connectors of some of the cloud services as well as other workloads. And it being a cloud service, you pay for what you use. So I'm not going to repeat my previous session. If you want to know more about Azure Sentinel in general, then I would encourage you to go to my YouTube channel and find my overview session from last month, which is about an hour long on all of the things with Azure Sentinel. But today we'll really be focusing on adversary emulation. One of the key items in Azure Sentinel is investigation UI. We have a lot of data that we can work with, that we can alert on, that you can then use through things like Gusto, KQL language. But you probably want to use an investigation UI to really use your cognitive skills to understand how threats are evolving, what things are occurring, from which perspective, which endpoint, and so forth. And so in the course of this session, I'll show you with respect to adversaries how to work the investigation UI to really get a picture of what's happening, I guess, in your environment. Now let's define adversary. This is from the Merriam-Webster book. An adversary is defined as one that contends with, opposes, or resists, aka an enemy or opponent. And the same goes, of course, for the cyber world. Those are people, actor groups, nation states that have a certain incentive to attack you, your business, or your IP, and for their personal or country's benefit. So where do you start with all of this? Well, I would encourage you to have a look at MITRE. And MITRE is a non-profit organization. It's been around a while. You can find it on mitre.org. And what it essentially provides you, among other things, is an open library on attack groups, on attack methods, on the mitigations you could apply, and much more. A lot of tools, techniques, procedures, TTPs that they publish along with the community to give you a picture of all of the things and attack vectors that could potentially occur in your environment. And they've put that in a framework called ATTACK. And ATTACK is there for enterprise. There's an ATTACK for IoT and OT worlds. There's ATTACK for AWS or cloud, Azure. So the MITRE organization really provides you with a wealth of information and things that you could consider as part of your starting to do some homework with adversaries and the offensive side. Now, if you look at that attack framework, it gives you a couple of phases in which the cyber kill chain is evolving. So from initial access, reconnaissance to execution, persistence, and so forth. Under those tactics, as they are called, you find the TTPs, so the tactics and the procedures and the tools. Those will give you insights in the big chunks of things and methods that people and actor groups are using. And since recently, there's also sub-techniques, and they dive a bit deeper into the specifics of a certain technique that those actors then use. like a certain PowerShell attack or a certain other vector that you can learn more into detail about. One example I'd like to take for this session, and I've just took one, I could have taken any of the dozens of others, but I'm taking the signed binary proxy execution. So where an actor is using a binary to execute something else. And this example, I'm using a sub-technique called the MSHTA, and we'll have a look at that in a second. Now, these are individual techniques or tools or procedures, but you probably also want to learn more about actor groups, and MITRE does publish some of the information around actor groups, like for instance the APT29. But more importantly, they do yearly evaluations, or they invite vendors to participate into yearly evaluations where a certain actor group or their techniques are simulated, and where then they measure how well a certain endpoint solution or another solution then detects or responds to those threats. And in 2020, they invited vendors to participate in the APT29 evaluation. They provided with what of the TTPs they will be measuring, and then one of the vendors participating was Microsoft, and on their blog they wrote a detailed debrief on how Microsoft Defender, together with all of the other security technologies, then led to detecting those that APT29 group. Now, this is an example of the kill phase, the kill chain phases, where initial access, initial breach, persistence, lateral movement, and the others are then noted. All of the telemetry that was provided, and then all of the detections that took place. Now, if you're looking for other information for other actor groups, then MITRE is of course a great starting point, but certainly some of the bigger security firms like Fox IT or FireEye or others do publish their bit of information in the year. Late last year, Fox IT published about TA505, which is a sophisticated and innovative threat actor, which was allegedly attributed to the University of Maastricht attack, which you might know from if you live in the Netherlands. It was on the evening news. And the great thing about the Fox IT article is that it contains a lot of detailed information about that actor, their methods, and how they move. And those are things you could potentially replicate in your environment, get an understanding from, and maybe start exercising so that you can learn from that offensive side into upping your defense. So certainly this blog is something that is worthwhile looking at. So let's have a look. I've switched to my browser and I'm logged into attack.mitra.org. And here you find the homepage of the nonprofit organization. If I then search for the tactic that I wanted to outline, let me do a refresh of the page. Here we go. I'm looking for T number 1218. Here's the signed binary proxy execution. Then it gives me a basic understanding of the attack vector. It also gives me an understanding that this is part of defense evasion. Here we go. That it's often used on the Windows platform. And if we scroll down, we also get information about the mitigations and the detections. If we go into a sub-technique, the 05, the HTA version, we get more information about the Microsoft HTML application files, how they are used to execute another application, but also MITRE then hints you to the groups that might be using this. And if I click on APT32, for instance, we get the name of the group and some more information about it. So this is pretty cool. If you go back to the home screen and go to matrices, on the left-hand side, you see the different frameworks. So there's one called Enterprise, which we were looking at just now. And there's also one, for instance, for cloud and specifically for AWS, which gives you information of the potential attack vectors that these folks could then be using in well, these kinds of environments. If we go back to APT 29, the one that AttackMitra used last year to evaluate the vendors, then you see that AttackMitra publishes these on a GitHub repo called AttackArsenal. And I've cloned this repo onto disk. So going into adversary emulation, APT 29 emulation plan, you do get the PDF with some information, but if I go, for instance, into day 2 and payloads, you see that some of these files are available to you on trying to bypass UAC, trying to do a credential dump, and more of these things. So these you can just take in your environment as examples to do an emulation yourself. Now, if you're interested in understanding how Microsoft did, then again, I would encourage you to have a look at their blog. Talking about blogs, this was one I was referring to from Fox IT that gives you a brief history on TA505, which became a mature, innovative, and a well-known adversary. There are some examples on how they work, some of the infection processes with their bots, infection chains, and really, if you dive deeper, there's a lot of information, for instance, also on the time schedule they seem to be working on, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a need to really start understanding how these actors work, I would certainly encourage you to have a look at this blog. And of course, I'll be sharing the links for you easily after the session, so you can just go back to this information and have a good read. So certainly something I would encourage you to look at as part of your adversary emulation approach. All right, well, these are just this and that. There's techniques, procedures, some information about those actor groups, but I want to really excite you about the fact that there are professional red team exercises where either yourself, if you are a professional party, or an external professional party, like for instance our friends at Outflank, perform an offensive attack as if a certain threat actor would be targeting your organization. Now, if you're a financial organization in the EU, like a bank for instance, then you might want to have a look at a framework called TIBER. So TIBER is a threat intelligence based red teaming framework. It was standardized with the aim to streamline the procedure for red teaming projects, for instance, for national central banks, as well as critical other functions in the EU financial sector. These are not mandatory at this point, but banks and so forth can voluntarily adapt them. And again, if you want to exercise TIBER for your organization, then parties like Outflank are certified or at least recommended to perform these for you. Now again, let's have a quick look. There's information on other websites, for instance, that Dominic Altermat wrote on how the TIBER EU framework works, what it's trying to pursue, what it actually is, how the process works. So these are things for you to take home and then work with in your financial organization. But the great thing also, if you look, for instance, in our country, in the Netherlands, our Dutch National Bank, DNB, is also providing you with information on how this is to be used. And the great thing is, if you look at their website, there are all sorts of specific documents already available to you. If you need a red team test plan, you can just go ahead and download this Word document and take that as a template of sorts and work your way through it. So TIBER really provides you, if you are a financial institution in the EU, with some sort of approach, which is very much recommended if you want to do the offensive side, the red teaming, of course, to better your defenses and understand in the blue teams what to work against and how to raise the bar. Now, I've talked about the fact that we'll be doing an adversary emulation, and then we'll be looking at Azure Sentinel on how it would detect. But certainly one of the things to look at is Microsoft Defender in conjunction together with Azure Sentinel. And the easiest way I normally explain this to people is that Microsoft Defender is very much centric around protection, trying to protect you against these threats, maybe block them when they occur or ahead of time through security measures. But if they occur and if something happens from either an outside or an inside threat, Microsoft Defender also provides you with incident response capabilities. And essentially, the suite of Microsoft Defender products then is an XDR suite, providing you with those focus areas. Now, Azure Sentinel is very much a SIEM, so it's trying to collect all of these signals, not per se the raw data, because we can work with the signals in an integrated fashion, but collecting them in a way to combine them into a use case, really trying to combine 2 or more signals into a high fidelity, true positive alert or incident, which you can then investigate as part of your detection and maybe follow up from a threat hunting perspective. So where Defender and XDR is much focused on protection incident response, it works really great together with Azure Sentinel as part of it being a SIEM targeted at collection and detecting and investigation. Now, this provides you with an integrated threat protection story. Microsoft Defender is composed of several pieces. There's an endpoint solution, there's an identity solution, and so forth, as well as there's an Azure Defender, part of Azure Security Center, where it can protect and detect on things like containers, IaaS workloads, SQL, and whatnot. So I encourage you to look at those and use the connectors in Azure Sentinel to combine all of these signals into high fidelity use cases. Now, why am I also mentioning Microsoft Defender? Because it also provides you with great insights on these adversaries. There's a section called Threat Analytics, and it provides you with a detailed and deep dive information about certain threat actors. And of course, the one that shook up the industry quite a bit late last year was SolariGate, the SolarWinds attack, which Microsoft then published a lot of information about, and they also did a follow-up just recently. And let's have a look in a live demo. What I'll do is I'll log into security.microsoft.com, and this is, I guess, the first time we'll be showing the unified portal. This is now on the left-hand side, combining information from endpoints, from email and collaboration, together with other sources, but it's also providing you, like I said, with the threat analytics, which is an exciting piece to me. It's really detailed and spot on. Of course, you can search for certain attacks. Maybe if you're interested about PowerShell Empire or other frameworks. But let's say we want to understand this SolarWinds attack that was in the news quite a bit. Then we get overview information, but diving into the analyst report then gives us information about all of, again, the steps that the attackers were taking, all the way down to hashes and whatnot. So a lot of detailed information for you to understand this SolarWinds actor, but also if it is occurring in your environment. If you've rolled out Defender for Endpoint and it's watching your endpoints, then you also get information about impacted assets and the incidents occurring, or maybe things happening through some of the other solutions within Microsoft Defender. And like we just said, there's also a follow-up document, the missing link, which was published, I guess, 2 weeks ago. If we go into analyst report, we get even more information about how the C2 channel was working and deep information about all of the files and communication occurring. So this is really, really neat. And again, if you're interested in adversaries in general and information, maybe so that you can start building an emulation plan for your environment, then the threat analytics in Microsoft Defender are really, really good. Okay, so Microsoft 365 Defender, the new name for the suite of products. There's Microsoft Defender for identity, for endpoints, there's cloud apps, and of course for Office 365, which were all formerly called ATP. Now, a typical attack story is this, and this is, I guess, why Microsoft 365 Defender is important, is often you see a lot of the attacks happening and starting with phishing, spear phishing, an email with perhaps a link, providing you with as much information that users start clicking. We see that around 6 out of 10 attacks starts with phishing, so this is still important. Perhaps if your endpoint is not secured well enough, like the University of Maastricht, things happen on the endpoint, maybe a Meterpreter attack or a Cobalt Strike beacon that gets placed and planted. Often you then see some lateral movement and or credentials that get stolen. And based on those credentials, of course, they can start moving further, maybe perform a privilege escalation on other devices, and really then start moving laterally or into the cloud, for instance, what we also saw with SolarWinds, and then accessing information there based on the credentials and information they've then got, and of course inching closer to their core target of stealing some of your information or breaching some of your facilities. Now this all gets combined in, like we just saw, the new portal. The great thing is with the new Microsoft 365 Defender, the portal, is that these incidents and alerts happening are then also mapped back into the Mitra attacked framework. So the one we saw in the beginning with all of the tactics, tools and procedures, once alerts start happening, Microsoft Defender starts mapping them into the right categories, and you do get an overview, as you can see here on the left top, with a high impact environment. And we also see the devices that are impacted, users, mailboxes, the entities, and you can click further from here. Now, one of the things that I'm quite excited about that learns you quite a bit about how attacks work is the simulation that Microsoft provides you as part of Microsoft 365 Defender. If you go to the overview page, there's a simulation script you can run on an endpoint. It's non-intrusive, it won't kill things on your endpoint, but it does give you information on how certain code would execute. And there's a walkthrough for you to just really use quickly, step by step, and then also follow up with the alerts that are happening in the Microsoft 365 portal. Now, if you don't have any experience yet on tools like, for instance, CyberChef or other tools that you can use to follow an attack as it's happening and maybe often de-obfuscate or unencrypt certain parts of the attack, then I've written a blog on www.maartengoet.org where I'm taking this example, the simulation script from Microsoft Defender, and following it step by step on how to decompile the attack. And the interesting part is you end up with something called My Hovercraft is Full of Eels, of course, which is a reference from Monty Python. But I would be excited to see how far you get. So let me go to my blog. Here we go. It's on Medium. And among other things, there's Going Down the Rabbit Hole, is it called? And scrolling down, we talk a bit about the simulation I just referenced. And then we start decompiling how the code works. And we talk about, for instance, how CyberChef works and how we can take that code to really de-obfuscate or unencrypt. And the cool thing about CyberChef is it's got a hosted version. It's from GCHQ, the National Secret Service of England or the UK. It's hosted on GitHub, and you can just use it from here. So if you have some input, this is a test, and you want to encode it, for instance, to base 64, then here in the bottom window, you see the output, and the same goes, of course, when you're trying to decode it. Just put the input there, drag one of the tiles to the right, and you can build what is called a recipe of steps for you to work with that code, deobfuscate it, unencrypt it, unzip it, whatever it needs to happen. And then you can follow. But again, use my blog to get a step-by-step example from this. Okay, now we've talked about Mitra, we've talked about TTP, specifically 12.18, and I've just picked a random one, so don't worry about this one. But that was the one that uses the Microsoft HTML applications, MSHTA, to execute something else, so essentially a binary proxy. Now, if you want to execute that in your environment as part of an adversary emulation plan, then I would encourage you to have a look at a project called Red Canary. Red Canary is our small and highly portable detection tests, which are based on Mitra's attack framework. So you can go to this URL that I've noted on this screen, take for instance the T1218, and then you get specific code already written for you to run on, let's say, a Windows host to test. And then of course you can use your EDR software or your SIM, like Defender or Azure Sentinel, to see if it triggered. So you run the red test and then verify if the blue detection worked, essentially doing some purple teaming there and learning from each other. Now, copying these items to a Windows host and then executing them manually might be cumbersome. So another great project is called Invoke Atomic Test. Invoke such an atomic, such a test. And you can just give the parameter of T1218 and it would execute, it would copy the files, download it, execute it, and then give you a response whether it executed correctly or not. And I would say that's a great way to get started. Pick a certain technique, execute the test, and start tracking it, because you need to understand, of course, did it trigger? Did we see it? Did we get the right information? Were we able to assess whether or not it was a true positive and follow up with it? But also have some sort of spreadsheet, of course, to start tracking it so that you know which coverage you have. The one that you got the red test for, but also one that you got blue detections for, and then coloring those check marks purple. So this is something you could do. The question we get a lot is, how do I track those efforts? And funny enough, a lot of these tools don't have a proper tracking method, is what I found. So my great friends Ruben and Marcus have you covered. They've released an open project called Detect, again aligning with the Mitra attack framework and aligning with something that's called the Attack Navigator. And they've published it on this GitHub repo here on the screen, and you can use that to start tracking it. Now, one question you might have is, okay, but so should I only do the advanced ones because I want to know if somebody can do something really fancy? Well, I would say start with the basics. If you look at the blog that Red Canary just published, where they look back on 2020 and published their threat detection report, you see that the basics are still important. Scheduled task and PowerShell are among the still most prevalent threats observed last year. So these are things you should still look at, have detections for, know how to follow up, see how to see anomalies, etc. So basics are important. And again, this URL is really interesting. So have a look at the threat detection report to just get maybe a top 10 or 20 for your environment, and maybe use that as your starting point. Okay, let's have a look. Here is the repo I was talking about, the Red Canary repo. It has all of the information. If I go to Atomics, these are the individual tests, and I scroll down to T1218, and we had the 005 sub-technique, if you remembered. Then here's information on how that works. But if you look at source, here we actually see how these things are executed, and clicking on one gives me an example of code that would then run, in this case, how to spawn a calculator. But these would be things that you would run and that your detection should then grab and really understand if you're detecting this as part of a use case. There's also, like I mentioned, the invoke atomic red team, and the invoke atomic red team then allows you to do this from a PowerShell framework. If I go to execute an atomic test local, then you get information on how to do invoke atomic test, T1218, certain test numbers, and then how the output would be provided to you, etc. So this is really an interesting project, and encourage you to, of course, have a look at. And again, if you want to track this, wonderful, have a look at Ruben and Marcus's project called Detect, which is here, which allows you to track those things. There's a great talk, but also a blog from Ruben and from Marcus on how this is working. Encourage you to look at. But then the example is this: for each of these tactics, tools, and procedures, the T2Ps, you can mark them as if you have detected them, if you have coverage, and into which depth, and so forth. So this is really a wonderful project, I would say. Now, we also mentioned Attack Navigator. This is built on the Attack Navigator. If you Google Attack Navigator, you find a URL from Mitra, which allows you to run it in the cloud on GitHub, as well as fork the project or download it as a Docker container, etc. We'll say create a new layer for enterprise. And here again, you get this navigator. It's interactive, so that's pretty cool. If we go down to defense evasion, we see the one we were working with, the signed script, the signed binary proxy execution. And you could, for instance, say I want to color it red because I've done the atomic test. But if you right click again, you can also get some more information, view, let's say, the technique, and we come back full circle to the page we started in the beginning of the stream. This is how you get information about it. So that's pretty cool. All right. One of the other projects I would allow you to look at is called Infection Monkey. Again, there's more professional and paid for versions like Attack IQ or Skith, but this is an open project built by Guardicore. It's quite a black box, but then again, for a test environment, this could be a starting point for you to understand how to detect some of these things in your environment with Azure Sentinel, because it provides you with an automatic attack simulation. It also provides you with some actionable recommendations. And again, like much of these things, they align to Mitra's Attack Enterprise framework. And best of all, it's free. So you can just fiddle around with it, or like I'm doing, use it for a demo. So thank you to Swarte Ahmed for pointing that out. Now, it is part of the Azure Marketplace. If you search for Infection Monkey, you find a predefined VM that you can just deploy with everything already set up, which is something that I'll be doing. So let's go into the Azure portal. I'm logged in, and I'll hit create. And if we search for Infection Monkey, it should be coming up. Here we go. And then we find information about the Infection Monkey, and we can start with a preset configuration. The great thing is it configures pretty much everything. It also opens up the port for the portal and UI that you'll be using, so that's good. I've created one ahead of time, of course, I would say. So what I'll do is I'll log in to that one. Here we go. Here's the password. And what I've done is I've just took the defaults, configuration, and have this enabled. So it will try to execute some of these T2Ps from these tactics. It will also try some exploits like these. Some will be outdated, some might still be interested for your environment. And we ran it. We ran it from this dedicated VM, but you can also run it from a machine of choice. And then it found a couple of machines in my test environment that was successfully logged into and tried to exploit. And looking at some of the security reports, going into the attack report, it actually successfully used some of these. Those are the red colored or pink colored ones, like brute forcing, remote system discovery. And if I list all techniques and go down, you see the things that it tried to do successfully. So apparently it copied a Monkey32 executable into the environment and started to set up some channels. And for instance, I'll scroll down. It used an uncommonly used port, 5000, to communicate back to this infection monkey server, my C2 channel. So these are things you then might want to look into whether or not you have detections for. So going back to my environment, the Azure Sentinel instance in my environment, we do see information flowing in. And if I go to incidents, and I've prepared this over the past 3 days, I'll set my filter a bit back. For the past 3 days, we see incidents occurring, and I'm actually using Defender on those 3 machines as endpoint detection. And these are a couple of the things that it grabbed. So for instance, let's take this example, which tells us there's an unusual number of failed sign-in attempts on a certain server. It also tells us, if I zoom a bit in for y'all and move myself out of the view, we see that this is mapped to the initial access, again to the MITRE tactic framework. So we'll hit investigate. Here we go. It's opening up. There we come with the investigation UI. And zooming a bit in, we find certain entities that are involved, a certain IP address, a certain username and whatnot. And if we click on entities, here we go, we see the entities involved. Oops, sorry. The IP address, the VM name, the fact that it came in apparently through SSH, and so forth. And then if I click on timeline, here we go, I do get information about the fact that there's 2 times where it found an unusual number of failed logins, about 8 minutes after each other. Now, if I right-click this guy, this IP address, here we go, and I say related alerts, I actually zoom in. Let me zoom out. On the IP address, and it does gives me another alert or incident telling me that there was a successful SSH brute force attack. And clicking on this one, and we click on info, we do see a successful SSH brute force attack from this IP address. If we scroll a bit down, we also see that it succeeded, and we get information of which account it succeeded with, etc., etc. So these are things that really help you to understand what's happening. Going back to the incidents, let's take, for instance, 71, because Defender told me there's a malware incident on an endpoint. Again, hit investigate. Move this a bit to the side. And we'll start off with entities again. We see here's monkey32.exe, the rogue executable that it was trying to place, and some of the other information. If we take monkey32 and say, again here, let me show the related alerts to this bit of software, we do get a number of them. And interesting, if I go back to timeline, it starts to build up a timeline for me when it blocked the malware, when some anti-malware action failed, another piece of malware was blocked, etc. So these are interesting things. If I say this one was prevented and I click info, again I get more information on what's happening. But also the interesting part is if I take the URL that is provided, I go back into Microsoft Defender, and it gives me more information about the malware. I can see it in a timeline. If I click here on top, see in timeline, we get all of the events happening on that endpoint at that point in time. Here's the timeline one, where it remediated information about Monkey 32. And clicking on Monkey 32, I get the hashes. But I can also, for instance, click into virustotal.com, get information about who's finding it and blocking it, but also community information. And then we find, oh, this is just a piece of testing software, nothing to worry about. But also you could then go into advanced hunting from here, or in the new unified portal, of course. If you want to hunt across email, other endpoints, you could do the advanced hunting from here and really dive deeper on whatever interests you from this attack. And if you don't know KQL that much yet, I would urge you to also look at custoking.com from my great friend Johnny. It gives you a lot of information on basic search things, on detecting the IOCs from SolarWinds and whatnot. So Custom King is a great resource to use from here as well. Now, the great thing is Microsoft is investing a lot of money, time, and energy to do this right. So Forrester already 2 years ago predicted, make no mistake, Microsoft is a security company now. And I guess that's very much true. We saw numbers last week, I think, with they crossed the 10 billion in revenue on the security products, but more essentially, they're doing really well in keeping you safe. So I would certainly have you look at the Microsoft world. If you don't know how to red team, don't know how to set up Azure Sentinel or run the detection 24/7, then do have a look at our company, Wortel, where we provide a managed detection and response 24/7. And with our great friends like Falcon Force, like Outflank, we provide you with services that keep you safe. So would encourage you to look at our website. We do have an ebook, free Azure Sentinel ebook, if you want to read more about all of this, again on wortel.nl. And if you want to stay up to date with my blog, go to maartengoet.org. But I'm also running a podcast called securityinsiders.io, which gives you a lot of great sessions with people like Mark Smeets, Olaf Hartong, Ruben, and Marcus we just talked about, and their tooling. So lots of things for you to subscribe in your favorite podcast app. Talking about subscribing, if you like this and if you want to do future live streams with me, then go to my channel, hit the subscribe or hit the like button, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Martin. That was amazing. Thanks very, very much for that. So we do have some